On the morning of the 13th of October, 1985, the warmth of a Sarasota sunrise didn't greet Frank Stafford with the peace of a new day. It welcomed him into a nightmare. He had just returned from a long night working behind the bar at the Playground Lounge, a now closed watering hole in the heart of Sarasota, Florida. The house was quiet, too quiet. Inside their home on the 300 block of Tarpon Avenue, 28-year-old Denise Mory Stafford lay dead, strangled to death in the sanctuary of her own bedroom. Her 1-year-old daughter was unharmed, still in the house, alone, innocent, and likely unaware of the violence that had stolen her mother in the middle of the night. Police determined that the attack occurred sometime between 11 p.m. on the 12th of October and 10:30 a.m. the next morning. The details painted a harrowing picture. Denise appeared to have been standing when she was first struck. Then, after the final act of violence, her killer moved her, laying her on the bed in a way that seemed too intentional, too arranged. There was something almost theatrical about it, chilling in its suggestion of control. The Sarasota Police Department arrived quickly and did what they could with what they had. Crime scene photos were taken, evidence was collected, statements were made. Suspicion, as it often does, turned to those closest. But as investigators expanded their focus, one name began to stand out: Joseph Magaletti, Jr. He wasn't a stranger. In fact, he was very familiar to both Denise and Frank. He worked as a bouncer at the Playground Lounge, where Frank tended bar and Denise sometimes helped. There had been whispers, gut feelings, and subtle cues. But feelings aren't evidence. And back in 1985, investigators lacked the forensic tools they needed to prove anything. They interviewed Magaletti. They dug. But nothing stuck. He walked free. And the case grew cold. What no one could have known then was that justice for Denise wouldn't come through a witness or confession. It would come through the silent preservation of science. At a time when DNA testing was still science fiction to most people, a visionary named Dr. Rudiger Breitnecker was freezing bodily fluid samples from assault victims, preserving them not for today, but for a future that might one day exist. He didn't know what technology might emerge. He only knew that truth often hides in the smallest traces. That decision would one day become the cornerstone of justice for victims like Denise. Fast forward to 2020. Retired Detective Jeff Birdwell, who had served in the Sarasota Police Department's Criminal Investigations Division, couldn't stop thinking about Denise. He hadn't moved on long after many had. He reopened the file. He dusted off old boxes. And with modern DNA testing capabilities now sharper than ever, he sent Denise's clothing and other evidence to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and partnering agencies. In July 2021, the results came back. There it was. Evidence that had lived silently for decades suddenly spoke louder than any interrogation ever could. But justice had arrived a few years too late. Magaletti had died in 2015, 6 years before the DNA match, while serving a life sentence for the murder of Kathleen Leonard, his neighbor in Sarasota. That crime, too, involved strangulation. Leonard had been bound with a white towel, one that held a single strand of Magaletti's hair. It had been enough to finally put him behind bars. It's believed Magaletti may have been a serial predator. In addition to Denise and Kathleen, he was also a suspect in the January 1987 murder of 19-year-old Elizabeth Zaya, who was kidnapped near Sarasota Square Mall and found beaten to death in downtown Sarasota. Magaletti had delivered water to Network Video, where Zia worked. Though never charged in her case, the pattern was undeniable. In a 1996 interview with the Herald Tribune, Magaletti had offered a hauntingly cryptic statement: "I ain't no angel. I do not claim to be, but I ain't no perpetrator. But DNA doesn't lie." And Denise's clothing held the truth the system couldn't prove for more than 35 years. On the 11th of August, 2021, the Sarasota Police Department held a press conference. This is years of work by not only myself, but sworn detectives and fellow civilians at the Sarasota Police Department who have a passion to close these cases, Birdwell said. Thanks to science and advancements in DNA testing and technology, all cold cases have a chance. We are not giving up on any case, and this case being solved 35 years later is a testament to that. His voice was steady but heavy with the weight of years and lives interrupted. Then he said something that echoed beyond the microphones. Everyone matters, or no one matters. That was the heartbeat of the department's renewed cold case efforts. For Denise's mother, Dora Kipper, the closure was a long time coming. He is not going to harm anyone else, she said. From the beginning, I did not want to see any other mother go through what our family has. The police department has done a fabulous job. Denise's daughter, now grown, had lived her entire life under the shadow of a question that no child should carry. She lost her mother before she could remember her. There were no more bedtime stories, no more lullabies, only silence and photos and pain. But now, at last, there was an answer. The story of Denise Marie Stafford is not just about a life cut short. It's about time and what survives it. It's about science, the kind that waits patiently in freezers, in labs, in files stored away in evidence lockers. It's about people who never stop asking why and who and when. It's about a young mother, robbed of her future, whose voice was preserved in fiber and skin cells and finally heard through strands of code. She didn't live to see her name cleared, but her story, her life, and her truth endures. It reminds us that even the coldest of cases can thaw in time, and that sometimes justice simply needs to wait for the right moment. And eventually, it arrives.
In the quiet neighborhoods of Missouri and Illinois, where life moved at its usual pace, no one suspected that a predator lurked in the shadows. He was methodical, precise, and merciless. Over time, his body count grew, and the streets whispered of a phantom killer. For the families of the victims, life would never be the same. They were daughters, sisters, and mothers. Women with dreams, aspirations, and struggles. Women whose stories would be cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. The nightmare began in the spring of 2001. Teresa Wilson was the second victim identified, but long before she was reduced to a case number, she was a woman of substance. She had a laugh that could light up a room and a resilience that had seen her through hard times. Growing up, she was a bright student with a passion for music. Life, however, had not been kind. Personal struggles led her down a difficult path, one that would eventually make her vulnerable to the monster that lurked in the dark. Brenda Beasley had a similar story. She had dreams, ambitions, and the will to turn her life around. She had a young son she adored, and she worked tirelessly to ensure he had a better future. But like Teresa, her struggles led her to the streets, where she became another unsuspecting target. These women weren't nameless, faceless victims. They were people. They had loved, laughed, and cried. They had people who cherished them, people who would grieve them deeply when they disappeared. As the spring of 2001 rolled in, the killings started. One by one, women from the streets vanished, only to be found dumped near highways, in wooded areas, or along the banks of the Mississippi River. Each body told a story of horror. The cause of death varied. Some had been strangled, and others had suffered prolonged torture before their lives were snuffed out. But they all shared one thing in common: the brutality of their final moments. Police worked tirelessly, piecing together clues. A pattern began to emerge. The killer was organized and calculated. He knew where to find his victims, how to lure them in, and how to erase his tracks. The evidence was scarce, the fear was growing. And then, the letters arrived. As the bodies piled up, the city grew uneasy. Women who once walked the streets freely now looked over their shoulders. The killer was still out there, the police had few leads, and the media was starting to take notice. Then, in May 2002, the case took a shocking turn. At the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, journalist Bill Smith was no stranger to crime stories. He had covered human interest pieces, shedding light on those societies often overlooked. When he wrote about Teresa Wilson's unsolved murder, he never expected a response from the killer himself. A letter arrived. "Dear Bill, nice sob story on Teresa Wilson," it read. The writer wasn't done, he taunted Smith, instructing him to write about another victim, Greenwade. "Write a good one, and I'll tell you where many others are to prove I'm real." Attached to the letter was something far more chilling, a hand-drawn map. The coordinates led to an overgrown, abandoned lot. There, buried beneath dirt and decay, lay the remains of another woman. The letter was no hoax, the killer had just announced himself. Police scrambled. The letter was their best lead, their first real connection to the man who had eluded them for so long. Forensic analysts pored over the paper, searching for fingerprints, DNA, and anything that could identify the author. Nothing. The killer had been careful. Then came the breakthrough. The burial map had been printed from a website, Expedia.com. Investigators turned to the Illinois State Police Cybercrimes Unit for help. One question burned in their minds. Who had searched for these coordinates? Expedia's logs provided the answer. A single IP address had generated the map. The digital footprint led them to an internet service provider, UUNET. With a court order in hand, detectives obtained the subscriber's details. Is the name attached to the IP address? Mory Travis, a convicted felon. More than that, records showed that Travis had been incarcerated between November 2001 and February 2002. It explained the sudden halt in murders. Detectives now had their suspect. They wouldn't let him slip away. On June 7th, 2002, police descended on Mory Travis's suburban home. Located in Ferguson, Missouri, the house seemed unremarkable. A neatly kept lawn, a quiet street. Nothing suggested the horrors inside. Travis opened the door. He was calm and cooperative, but beneath that facade lay a man with secrets he never intended to reveal. As officers searched the house, they found something deeply unsettling. Upstairs, the home was pristine, nothing out of place. But then they reached the basement. Inside, they uncovered a world of horror. Bloodstains marked the walls and floors. A dimly lit room contained a single bed. A videotape sat near a VCR. Police played the tape. What they saw shocked them to their core. Mory Travis had done more than kill. He had recorded his crimes. The footage was beyond brutal. It was a window into pure evil. On the tapes, Travis could be heard taunting his victims. His voice shifted between threats and twisted tenderness. One woman, bound and terrified, sobbed as Travis loomed over her. "You know what's about to happen," he whispered. She pleaded and begged. Travis tightened the ligature around her throat. "Don't fight it," he murmured. "It'll be over soon." And then, silence. This wasn't a single murder. The tapes documented multiple victims. Some were tortured for hours, and others died within minutes. Travis spoke to them as if he owned them, as if their suffering was his to control. The women weren't just bodies to him, they were trophies. While investigators sifted through the horror, they needed more than just video proof. One officer watching Travis during questioning had an idea. He handed Travis a can of Diet Coke. Travis drank it, unaware that it would seal his fate. Once discarded, the can was sent to a DNA lab. The results came in. Travis's DNA was a perfect match to samples found at 2 crime scenes. It was over. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Travis remained eerily calm. He denied nothing, he admitted nothing. But the tapes spoke for him. The police charged Travis with multiple counts of murder. They were certain he was responsible for at least 12 deaths, but they suspected the number was far higher. In one chilling moment on the tapes, Travis even bragged about his crimes. "I bet you can't count how many there are," he chuckled. "That's because there are too many." Before he could be tried, before the families of his victims could face him in court, Mory Travis made his final move. On June 10th, 2002, just 3 days after his arrest, Travis was found hanging in his jail cell. He had used a bedsheet to take his own life. For the detectives who had worked tirelessly to bring him to justice, it was a bitter end. For the families of his victims, it was a stolen confrontation. He had evaded punishment. He had denied them the chance to see him sentenced. The city of St. Louis was left reeling. Mory Travis had been a ghost, a man living an ordinary life while committing unimaginable crimes. His neighbors, his family, and even his girlfriend had never suspected the darkness within him. The families of the victims were left with grief that would never fully heal. Teresa Wilson's mother spoke through tears. "I just wanted to ask him why. Why did he do this to my baby?" She would never get her answer. He was a coward. He took the easy way out. He knew what he did, and he knew he'd pay for it. In the end, Mory Travis never faced a jury. He never saw the inside of a prison. But his legacy of horror remained. The Travis case changed how law enforcement handled digital evidence. The use of IP tracking in criminal investigations has become more common. But one question still lingers. Were there more victims? Travis hinted at numbers far beyond what police could confirm. 17, 20, more. To this day, some of his victims may still be out there, their families left without closure. What is certain is this: Mory Travis was one of the most sadistic killers in American history, and if not for a letter, a map, and a can of Diet Coke, he might have remained just another man living among us. On a warm summer afternoon in rural Washington, a young couple sought solace in the woods, eager to escape prying eyes and steal a few moments of passion. Their love was a secret, a forbidden romance that thrived in the shadows. They wanted seclusion, a place where the world couldn't find them. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, their search for intimacy took a horrifying turn. Their car moved smoothly along the dirt road until something abruptly blocked their path, a large log lying across the road, preventing them from driving any further. Assuming it was just an obstacle placed by nature, the man stepped out, his partner following closely behind. They were prepared to move the log, clear the way, and continue their journey. But as they approached the obstruction, a chilling sight stopped them in their tracks. Beyond the log, just 15 feet away, a body lay motionless. The young woman was sprawled out on the ground, clad in nothing but bikini-style underwear, knee-length socks, and boots. Her blue jeans and other clothing had been scattered around the scene. At first, the couple thought she was dead. But then she moved. A faint breath escaped her lips. She was still alive, though barely. A bullet wound marred the right side of her head. Blood had matted her dark hair, her skin pallid from the trauma. She wasn't speaking, she couldn't, but life still clung to her fragile body. In a desperate bid to save her, the man scooped her up, placing her in the passenger seat of his sports car. His lover held the young woman's head up, keeping her airway open as they sped toward the nearest hospital. The ride felt agonizingly long, every passing second diminishing their hope. By the time they reached the hospital, she was still breathing. The doctors rushed to her side, working frantically to keep her alive. But it was too late. She took her last breath before they could even begin treatment. She had arrived as a mystery, with no ID, no purse, and no name. A nameless victim whose only voice was the wound that told the story of her suffering. That young woman was Jodie Lumis. Jodie was 20 years old, full of life, full of dreams. She had an adventurous spirit, a kind heart, and a deep love for animals. Horses were her passion, and she spent most of her free time at a local stable, riding her beloved horse, Saudi. That summer afternoon, she had set out on her bike, planning to visit the stable for a ride before returning home. She had no idea she would never make it back. Her family remembered her as independent and fearless, someone who refused to be defined by the expectations of others. She had a vibrant energy that made people gravitate toward her. For her younger sister, Jana Smith, Jodie was more than just a sibling. She was a role model, someone she adored. Jana was only 12 years old when Jodie was murdered. She vividly recalled that last afternoon, watching her sister pedal away on her bike. "It was a beautiful day," she later said. "She told me she'd be back before dark." But darkness came and Jodie never returned. The crime scene painted a harrowing picture. Jodie's body had been discarded in the woods like an afterthought. Her clothing had been ripped off and her underwear had been pulled down but then repositioned. Her boots had been placed back on after the assault. The positioning of her body suggested that she had been trying to tie her left shoe when her attacker pulled the trigger, ending her life. Investigators quickly determined that this was a sexually motivated crime. Sperm was found on Jodie's underwear, an undeniable sign of assault. The brutality of her murder sent shockwaves through the community. Women became afraid to go out alone. Parents warned their daughters to stay close to home. Fear gripped the town like a vice, especially when more young women started vanishing under eerily similar circumstances. At the time, a serial killer was hunting young women across the Pacific Northwest. His name was Ted Bundy. The similarities between Jodie and Bundy's known victims were chilling. She was young, beautiful, and had her hair parted down the center, just like many of the women he had abducted and killed. Investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that Bundy had claimed yet another life. But as they examined the details of Jodie's case, something didn't fit. Bundy had a well-established pattern. He would lure his victims by feigning an injury, wearing a sling, using crutches, or pretending to struggle with his car so that unsuspecting women would offer to help him. Once he had them in his grasp, he would strike. His victims were often last seen willingly getting into a car with him. Jodie's case was different. She had been alone, riding her bike in the woods, nowhere near a parking lot or a busy street. Furthermore, Bundy's preferred method of killing was strangulation. Jodie had been shot in the head. The MO was all wrong. Ted Bundy was eliminated as a suspect, and with no other leads, Jodie's case went cold. The years passed, then the decades. Her murder remained a mystery. There were no new suspects, no fresh evidence, nothing to reignite the search for her killer. Her family was left with unanswered questions and fading hope. Jana Smith grew up with the unbearable weight of knowing her sister's murderer was still out there, living freely while Jodie lay in her grave. Then, in the early 2000s, everything changed. A new cold case unit was established, a team dedicated to solving long-forgotten murders. Detective Jim Shaw took on Jodie's case, determined to find her killer. He pored over old files, hoping for a clue that had been overlooked. And then he found it, Jodie's boots. With advances in forensic science, investigators sent the boots to the crime lab, hoping for DNA evidence. What they found was astonishing. A small stain on Jodie's left boot contained DNA. It was tested, analyzed, and entered into the system. After nearly 50 years, there was finally a match. The DNA belonged to a man named Terrence Miller. Miller had lived in the area for years, blending into the community. To his neighbors, he was an ordinary man, someone who ran a ceramics business, a husband, a father, and a grandfather. But Miller had a dark past. Just a few years after Jodie's murder, he had been arrested for child molestation and statutory rape. Yet, due to a legal loophole, he had managed to avoid serious prison time. Now, the police needed to confirm the match. They began following Miller, watching his every move, waiting for an opportunity to collect a fresh DNA sample. Their chance came when Miller visited a local casino. Detectives observed him ordering a cup of coffee. He took a sip, then casually discarded the cup into the trash. Seconds later, the detectives retrieved it. The cup was sent to the crime lab for testing. When the results came back, the answer was irrefutable. It was a perfect match. After 46 years, Jodie Lumis's killer had finally been identified. In 2019, Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His trial began in 2020, but before the jury could deliver their verdict, Miller took his own life. On the very morning the jury was set to announce their decision, he shot himself in his home. Moments later, the jury returned to the courtroom and declared him guilty. Jodie's family felt a mix of emotions, relief, frustration, closure, and anger. Jana had waited nearly half a century for justice, only for Miller to escape it at the last moment. "I wanted to see him in handcuffs," she said. "I wanted him to suffer in prison. He took that from us." Though he never faced a prison sentence, his guilt was undeniable. Jodie's case was finally closed. After decades of silence, she had been given a voice, and her family, at long last, had their answer. For nearly 50 years, Jodie Lumis's murder remained a mystery. A young woman, full of dreams and ambition, was taken too soon in a brutal act of violence. However, thanks to advancements in forensic science and the relentless pursuit of justice, her killer was finally identified. Although he escaped prison by taking his own life, the truth prevailed, bringing closure to a case that had haunted her family for years, decades. This case serves as a reminder that no crime should ever be forgotten. Cold case investigations and forensic genealogy have the power to bring long overdue justice to victims and their loved ones. There are still countless families waiting for answers, still seeking justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. If you or someone you know has information on an unsolved case, don't hesitate to reach out to law enforcement. Even the smallest detail could be the key to unlocking the truth. Support organizations dedicated to solving cold cases and advocate for the use of advanced forensic techniques to bring justice to those who have waited far too long. Justice may be delayed, but it should never be denied. Let's keep fighting to bring closure to families and ensure that no victim is ever forgotten.